The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains, sending a flock of startled ravens into the pale Montana sky as Harriet Thorne crouched behind the overturned stagecoach, her fingers trembling against the cold metal of a borrowed revolver. She had never imagined her journey west would end like this, stranded in the middle of nowhere with 3 dead passengers, a wounded driver, and bandits circling like vultures in the growing twilight of 1875. "Miss, can you hear me?" The voice came from somewhere beyond the coach, deep and steady despite the circumstances. "I'm coming around from the east side. Don't shoot." Harriet pressed herself against the weathered wood, her heart hammering against her ribs as dust settled on her once fine traveling dress. The life she'd left behind in Boston seemed a lifetime away now, not merely 3 weeks of travel. A figure moved into view, tall and broad-shouldered, the silhouette unmistakably that of a cowboy. His hands were raised, showing he meant no harm, though a rifle was slung across his back and a pistol rested at his hip. "The bandits are gone," he said, lowering his hands slowly. "Scared them off, but they might circle back. We need to move." In the fading light, Harriet could make out his features' sun-weathered skin, a strong jawline shadowed with stubble, and eyes that reminded her of the endless Montana sky. Not the rough-edged outlaw she'd feared, but not entirely comforting either. "Mr. Patterson needs help," she managed, gesturing to the driver who lay moaning several feet away. "He's been shot." The cowboy nodded, moving with purpose toward the injured man. "Name's Tucker Hawkins," he said, kneeling beside the driver. "I've got a place about 3 miles east of here. Can get you both there before dark if we hurry." Harriet watched as he examined the wound with practiced hands. "I'm Harriet Thorne. I was traveling to Helena to meet my uncle." Tucker glanced up, his expression unreadable in the dimming light. "That's still 2 days' ride from here, Miss Thorne. And I don't reckon you'll be continuing tonight." Within minutes, he had fashioned a makeshift tourniquet for the driver and helped him onto his horse. Tucker turned to Harriet, extending a hand. "You'll have to ride with me. Can you manage that?" Harriet hesitated, looking back at the coach where her trunk lay among the scattered luggage. Everything she owned in the world was in that trunk, the last remnants of her old life. "We can come back for your things tomorrow," Tucker said, reading her thoughts. "Right now, we need to get somewhere safe." With a reluctant nod, Harriet placed her hand in his, allowing him to help her onto the horse behind Patterson. Tucker took the reins, leading them away from the scene of devastation and into the gathering darkness of the Montana wilderness. The journey to Tucker's homestead seemed to take both an eternity and no time at all. Harriet's mind raced with questions about the man leading them to safety. He wasn't dressed like the cowboys she'd glimpsed from the stagecoach windows, no flashy spurs or elaborately tooled leather. His clothes were practical, well-worn, and his manner was taciturn but not unfriendly. As they crested a small rise, a cabin came into view, nestled against a backdrop of pines with a small barn nearby. A lamp glowed in the window, throwing warm light onto the packed earth yard. "Home," Tucker said simply, leading them toward the welcoming glow. The cabin was modest but sturdy, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area combined, and 2 doors leading to what Harriet presumed were bedrooms. Tucker helped Patterson to a chair before stoking the fire in the stone hearth. "I'll need hot water and clean cloths," he said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. His hair was the color of dark honey, cut short at the sides but longer on top. Harriet stood awkwardly in the center of the room, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance and the impropriety of her situation. Here she was, alone with a strange man in his home, miles from civilization. As if sensing her discomfort, Tucker spoke without looking up from the fire. "You're safe here, Miss Thorne. I give you my word. Once Patterson is tended to, I'll make up the spare room for you." There was something in his tone, a quiet dignity that made Harriet believe him. She removed her dusty gloves and set to work helping him care for the wounded driver. Hours later, with Patterson sleeping fitfully in one of the bedrooms, Harriet sat at the rough-hewn table, a cup of hot coffee between her hands. Tucker sat across from her, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. "You handled yourself well today," he said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Most city women I've met would have been hysterical after what you went through." Harriet smiled faintly. "I'm not most city women, Mr. Hawkins, so I gathered." His eyes met hers briefly. "What brings you to Montana territory, if you don't mind my asking?" Harriet traced the rim of her cup with one finger, considering how much to share with this stranger who had saved her life. "My parents died last winter. Influenza. My uncle is my only remaining family, and he offered me a home in Helena." Tucker nodded, offering no platitudes for her loss, which Harriet found strangely comforting. "And you?" she asked, curious about this solitary man. "How does a man end up alone in the wilderness?" A shadow crossed his face. "War has a way of making a man appreciate solitude, Miss Thorne. The war, of course. It had been 10 years since its end, but the nation still bore its scars, as did the men who had fought in it." "Will you be staying in Helena long?" Tucker asked, changing the subject. Harriet sighed. "I don't know. My uncle owns a mercantile there. He's offered me work, but it's not what you want," Tucker finished for her. "No," she admitted. "I was a teacher in Boston. I had hoped to continue teaching here, but I'm not sure what opportunities exist." Tucker set his rifle aside. "Schools are starting up in most towns now. Helena would certainly need teachers." He paused. "Though teaching out here isn't like teaching back east. The children come from all walks of life, miners' kids, ranchers' children, some who have never held a book before." Harriet felt a spark of interest. "Have you taught Mr. Hawkins?" A smile touched his lips for the first time. "No, madam, but I've done my share of learning. Out here, everyone teaches everyone something." The conversation drifted to lighter topics as the night deepened around the cabin. Harriet found herself relaxing in Tucker's presence, her initial wariness giving way to cautious respect for this quiet, capable man. When exhaustion finally overtook her, Tucker showed her to the small second bedroom. "It's not much," he said, lighting a lamp on the bedside table, "but it's clean." The room was Spartan but neat, with a narrow bed covered in a faded quilt, a small chest of drawers, and a basin for washing. "Thank you," Harriet said, lingering in the doorway, "for everything." Tucker nodded, his expression serious. "Get some rest, Miss Thorne. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to get you to Helena." As he turned to leave, Harriet called after him. "Mr. Hawkins." He paused, looking back at her. "Please call me Harriet." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Good night, Harriet. Sleep well." Morning came with the sounds of livestock, chickens clucking, a cow lowing softly, and the nickering of horses. Harriet woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly in her rumpled traveling outfit, doing her best to smooth the wrinkles and pin her hair into some semblance of order. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Tucker at the stove, frying bacon in a cast iron skillet. He glanced up as she entered, nodding a greeting. "How's Mr. Patterson?" Harriet asked, noticing the other bedroom door was ajar. "Fever broke during the night. He's weak, but he'll live." Tucker transferred the bacon to a plate where eggs were already waiting. "Hungry?" Harriet realized she was famished. They ate in companionable silence, the morning sun streaming through the cabin's windows, casting everything in a golden glow. "I need to check on my stock," Tucker said when they'd finished. Then we can ride back to the coach, see what's salvageable. With luck, the bandits were more interested in the strongbox than passengers' belongings. I can help with the chores, Harriet offered, gathering their plates. I'm not completely useless around a farm. Tucker looked surprised but nodded. Much obliged. Outside, the day was promising to be fine, with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and wild sage. Tucker's homestead was larger than it had appeared in the darkness, a small but thriving operation with a vegetable garden, a chicken coop, a modest barn, and corrals for horses and cattle. Harriet followed Tucker to the barn, where he showed her how to milk the cow, a gentle Jersey named Buttercup, while he mucked out stalls and fed the horses. Working alongside him, Harriet found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. There was an economy to his movements, a quiet confidence that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin and his place in the world. "You've built something special here," she said as they walked back to the cabin, her carrying a pail of fresh milk, him with a basket of eggs. Tucker surveyed his property with a critical eye. "It's a start. 5 years ago this was just wilderness, still got a lot to do. All by yourself, hired hands during calving and branding. Rest of the time it's just me." He glanced at her. "And now you and Patterson, at least for a few days." Harriet felt a curious mix of emotions at his words: relief that she would have time to recover from the ordeal before continuing to Helena, and an unexpected disappointment that her stay would be temporary. After checking on Patterson, who was awake but weak, they saddled Tucker's 2 horses for the ride back to the stagecoach. The day had warmed considerably, and Harriet was grateful for the wide-brimmed hat Tucker had lent her for the journey. "Been meaning to ask," Tucker said as they rode side by side. "Did you get a look at any of the bandits? Might help the territorial marshal track them down." Harriet shook her head. "It happened so fast. They wore bandanas over their faces. All I remember is one had a distinctive scar across his hand like a burn." Tucker's expression darkened. "Sounds like the Blackwell gang. They've been hitting coaches along this route for months. You sound familiar with them." Tucker's jaw tightened. "Let's just say we've crossed paths before." Before Harriet could press for details, the remains of the stagecoach came into view. The scene looked even more desolate in daylight: the overturned coach, the scattered luggage, and the disturbed earth where the 3 unfortunate passengers had been hastily buried. Tucker dismounted first, scanning the area with a watchful eye before helping Harriet down. "Stay close," he warned. "They might have left someone to watch." They approached the coach cautiously, but the site appeared deserted. Birds had returned to the trees, singing as if nothing untoward had happened in this peaceful spot. Harriet's trunk had been broken open, its contents rifled through, but most of her clothing remained, along with a small box of personal mementos, her parents' miniature portraits, her mother's silver hairbrush, and a worn copy of Jane Eyre that had been her constant companion since childhood. As she gathered her belongings, Tucker examined the coach and the surrounding area with the eye of a tracker. "They headed north," he said, pointing to faint tracks in the dry soil, "probably making for the border." "You think they'll be caught?" Harriet asked, folding a dress into her trunk. Tucker straightened, his expression grim. "Not unless someone goes after them. Laws spread thin out here." Something in his tone made Harriet look up sharply. "Surely you're not thinking of pursuing them yourself?" His silence was answer enough. "That would be madness," she said, abandoning her packing to stand before him. "They murdered 3 people in cold blood. They would not hesitate to kill you too." Tucker met her gaze steadily. "Some things a man can't let stand, Harriet. And what good would your death do?" she challenged. "Would it bring back those people? Would it make the territory any safer? For a long moment, they stood facing each other, neither willing to back down. Finally, Tucker sighed, the tension leaving his shoulders. "Let's get your things back to the cabin," he said, avoiding her question. "Storm's brewing to the west. We don't want to be caught out in it." Harriet wanted to press the issue, but the darkening horizon warned that Tucker was right about the approaching weather. They loaded what they could salvage onto the horses and began the journey back to the homestead, the wind picking up as they rode. The storm broke just as they reached the cabin, fat raindrops turning quickly to a deluge that sent them rushing for shelter. They burst through the door laughing despite themselves, soaked to the skin and trailing water across the plank floor. "That was closer than I'd like," Tucker said, shaking water from his hat before hanging it up. "You're drenched." Harriet pushed wet hair from her face, suddenly self-conscious as her sodden dress clung to her frame. "I should change." Tucker nodded, turning away to give her privacy. "I'll check on Patterson and stoke the fire. You'll want to warm up." In the small bedroom, Harriet peeled off her wet clothes with difficulty, grateful for the dry garments she'd salvaged from her trunk. As she changed, she found herself thinking about the man in the next room, his quiet strength, his integrity, and the shadows that seemed to haunt him. When she emerged, wearing a simple blue day dress, Tucker had built up the fire and was preparing a pot of coffee. Patterson was awake, propped up in a chair with a blanket over his legs, looking pale but alert. "Miss Thorne," the driver greeted her weakly. "Mr. Hawkins was just telling me how you stood your ground against those bandits. That was mighty brave." Harriet shook her head, embarrassed. "I was terrified, Mr. Patterson. I'm just thankful Mr. Hawkins came along when he did." "Call me Tucker," he said, passing her a steaming cup. "Think we're past formalities at this point." The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rolling across the valley. Inside, the cabin felt like a sanctuary, warm and secure against the elements. As evening approached, Tucker prepared a simple but hearty meal of venison stew and cornbread, which they shared around the table while the storm gradually subsided. "When do you reckon the next stage will come through?" Patterson asked, his voice stronger after food and rest. "2 days, maybe 3, Tucker replied. "Depends on the condition of the roads after this rain." Harriet felt a curious twist in her stomach at the thought of leaving so soon. In just 1 day, this cabin and its owner had begun to feel familiar, almost comfortable. "I sent word with a passing rider this morning," Tucker continued. "Asked him to alert the stage company about what happened. They'll likely send someone to investigate before the next coach comes through." Patterson nodded, satisfied. "Thank you, Hawkins. You've done right by us." After dinner, Patterson retired early, his strength still limited by his injury. Harriet helped Tucker clean up, working in comfortable silence as the last of the storm passed and stars began to appear in the clearing sky. "Would you like to sit outside?" Tucker asked when they'd finished. "Night air's always freshest after a storm." Harriet nodded, following him onto the small porch where 2 chairs stood facing the distant mountains. They sat side by side, watching as the full moon rose, casting silver light across the landscape. "It's beautiful," Harriet said softly. "So different from Boston." Tucker made a sound of agreement. "That's what drew me here after the war, all that space and quiet, room to breathe." "Were you at Gettysburg?" she asked, venturing into territory she sensed was painful for him. Tucker was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. "Antietam," he said finally, "and the wilderness. Watched good men die in both places." Harriet could hear the weight of memory in his voice. "I'm sorry," he shrugged, his face half hidden in shadow. "War's long over." No use dwelling on it. But Harriet sensed he did dwell on it, perhaps more than he wanted to admit. Is that why you came out here, to forget? Tucker turned to look at her, his expression serious in the moonlight. Not to forget, to remember differently. To build something instead of destroying it. His words resonated with Harriet, who had come west seeking her own new beginning after loss. I understand that, she said quietly. They sat in silence for a while, the night sounds of the wilderness surrounding them, crickets chirping, an owl calling from the distant trees, the occasional rustle of wind through the grass. What will you do in Helena? Tucker asked eventually. Will you look for a teaching position? Harriet smiled, grateful for the change to a lighter topic. I hope to. My uncle means well, offering me work in his store, but I can't imagine spending my days selling calico and counting pennies. Tucker chuckled, a warm sound that Harriet realized she hadn't heard before. No, I can't see you behind a counter. You've got too much spirit for that. Spirit? Harriet raised an eyebrow. Is that what you call it, among other things? Tucker said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Determination, courage, stubbornness. Stubbornness. Harriet feigned offense but couldn't help smiling. I prefer to call it conviction. Call it what you like, Tucker said, his voice lighter than she'd heard it before. It'll serve you well out here. Montana territory doesn't suffer fools or the faint-hearted. And which am I in your estimation? Harriet asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Tucker turned to face her fully, his expression serious again. Neither, Harriet Thorne, neither. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different backgrounds. Harriet felt her heart quicken, and she looked away first, back to the moonlit landscape. It's getting late, she said, rising from her chair. I should turn in. Tucker stood as well, towering beside her on the small porch. Of course, sleep well, Harriet. As she turned to go inside, Harriet paused, looking back at him. Thank you for the conversation, Tucker. It's been nice to talk, he nodded, his expression softening. Likewise, good night. In her small room, Harriet lay awake long after she should have been sleeping, her mind filled with thoughts of the quiet cowboy whose home had become her temporary sanctuary. There was something about Tucker Hawkins that intrigued her, a depth of character, a complexity that belied his simple lifestyle. Morning came with clear skies and the promise of a beautiful day. Harriet woke early, eager to help with the chores before breakfast. She found Tucker already outside, splitting wood with powerful strokes of an axe. He worked shirtless in the cool morning air, and Harriet paused in the doorway, momentarily transfixed by the sight of his muscled back and shoulders, marked here and there with scars that could only have come from battle. Sensing her presence, Tucker turned, reaching for his shirt that hung on a nearby post. Morning, he said, pulling it on. Sleep well, Harriet nodded, hoping the flush she felt on her cheeks wasn't visible. Very well, thank you. I thought I might help with chores again before breakfast. Tucker buttoned his shirt, seemingly unaware of her momentary discomfiture. Appreciate that. Chickens need feeding and Buttercup's waiting for her milking. They fell into an easy routine over the next 2 days, working side by side to maintain the homestead while Patterson regained his strength. Harriet found herself enjoying the physical labor, the satisfaction of seeing immediate results from her efforts, whether it was gathering eggs or helping Tucker repair a section of fence damaged in the storm. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, talking until the stars came out in force. Tucker told her about his dreams for the ranch, expanding his herd, planting an orchard, perhaps building a larger house someday. Harriet shared stories of her teaching days in Boston, the children she had taught, and her hopes for finding similar fulfillment in Montana. On the third morning after the stagecoach attack, Tucker rode out early to check if the next coach was on schedule. He returned mid-afternoon with news. Stage will be through tomorrow. he announced as he dismounted in the yard where Harriet was hanging laundry. Stopped in at Freeman's trading post. They'd heard about the attack and are sending an armed escort with this one. Harriet nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. That's good news. I'm sure my uncle is worried by now. Tucker studied her face for a moment. You don't have to go, you know. Not right away. Her hands stilled on the damp sheet she was hanging. What do you mean? Tucker stepped closer, his expression earnest. You could stay here a while longer, get your bearings before deciding what you want to do in Helena. Harriet's heart raced at his suggestion. I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition, Tucker said quickly. Truth is, place feels different with you here. Better. The admission clearly cost him something, this man who seemed so self-contained, so comfortable in his solitude. Harriet found herself deeply touched by his words. I should at least let my uncle know I'm safe, she said, not quite a refusal. Tucker nodded. Of course. Could send a letter with Patterson on tomorrow's stage. You've thought this through, Harriet observed, a smile tugging at her lips. Tucker shrugged, looking almost boyish in his embarrassment. Had some time to think while I was riding. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of pink and gold, Harriet made her decision. I'll stay, she said simply. For a little while. Tucker's smile was worth any uncertainty she felt about delaying her arrival in Helena. Glad to hear it. The next morning, they helped Patterson onto the stagecoach, which had indeed arrived with an armed escort of 3 men. The driver was grateful for Tucker's care and promised to deliver Harriet's letter to her uncle personally. As the coach disappeared in a cloud of dust, Harriet felt a curious mixture of emotions: relief at not being aboard, anxiety about what her uncle would think of her decision, and a growing warmth when she looked at the man standing beside her. Well, Tucker said, turning to her with a smile, what would you like to do with your first day of freedom, Miss Thorne? Harriet laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. Show me more of your land. I want to see everything. Tucker saddled 2 horses, and they spent the day riding across his property meadows filled with wildflowers, stands of pine and aspen, a crystal-clear stream where trout darted in the shallows. Tucker pointed out landmarks and shared his plans for each area, his usual reserve giving way to enthusiasm as he spoke of the future. They stopped for a simple lunch on a hilltop overlooking a valley where Tucker's small herd of cattle grazed peacefully. Harriet leaned back on her elbows, watching clouds drift across the impossibly blue sky. I can see why you love it here, she said. It feels untamed, but in the best possible way. Tucker nodded, his gaze sweeping across his domain. That's it exactly. Wild but not threatening, free. Is that what you were looking for after the war? Freedom, among other things. Tucker plucked a stem of grass, twirling it between his fingers. Peace, mostly. Couldn't stand the noise of cities anymore. Too many people, too many reminders. Harriet watched him, seeing the shadows that still lurked behind his eyes when he spoke of that time. And have you found it? Peace? Tucker was quiet for a moment, considering her question. Most days. Some nights are harder than others. The nightmares, Harriet said softly, recognizing the haunted look she'd seen in other veterans' eyes back east. Tucker nodded once, a sharp movement. They come less often now. Work helps. Keeping busy. Impulsively, Harriet reached out, placing her hand over his. I'm glad you found this place then. Tucker looked down at their hands, then up at her face, something unreadable in his expression. For a moment, Harriet thought he might pull away, but instead he turned his hand to clasp hers gently. So am I, he said simply. They rode home as the afternoon waned, a comfortable silence between them. Harriet found herself studying Tucker's profile against the backdrop of mountains and sky, wondering about the life that had shaped him, the boy he had been before the war. the man he had become since. In the days that followed, they settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Mornings were for chores, feeding animals, tending the garden, repairing whatever needed fixing around the homestead. Afternoons might find them riding the property, fishing in the stream, or working on special projects. Tucker began teaching Harriet to shoot, setting up targets behind the barn where she could practice with his revolver. "You've got a good eye," he said approvingly as she hit the center of a tin can for the third time in a row. "Steady hand, too." Harriet lowered the gun, pleased with her progress. "I had a good teacher." Tucker's smile was becoming more frequent, transforming his serious face in ways that made Harriet's heart beat faster. Helps to have a willing student. Evenings were Harriet's favorite time. After supper, they would sit by the fire or on the porch, talking about everything and nothing, books they had read, places they had seen, dreams for the future. Sometimes Tucker would read aloud from one of the few books he owned, his deep voice bringing the words to life in the lamplight. A week passed, then two. Harriet received a letter from her uncle, delivered by a passing neighbor of Tucker's who had been to town. The letter was brief but kind, expressing relief at her safety and understanding of her need for time to recover from her ordeal. He would welcome her whenever she chose to come to Helena, he wrote, but there was no rush. "Your uncle sounds like a good man," Tucker said when she shared the contents with him. "He is," Harriet agreed. "I haven't seen him since I was a child, but I remember him being kind." "He was my mother's brother," Tucker nodded, adding another log to the fire as evening settled around the cabin. "Family's important out here, more than back east in some ways. People rely on each other more. Is your family back east?" Harriet asked, realizing she knew little about Tucker's background beyond his service in the war. A shadow crossed his face. "What's left of it? Parents died before the war. Had a brother who went west to California during the gold rush. Haven't heard from him in years." "I'm sorry," Harriet said softly. "It's hard being alone." Tucker looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Don't feel so alone these days." The simple statement, delivered without artifice or pretense, touched Harriet deeply. "Neither do I," she admitted. Something was growing between them, something neither had put into words yet, but which existed nonetheless in shared glances, in the brush of hands when passing tools or dishes, in conversations that stretched late into the night. On a particularly warm afternoon in late September, Tucker suggested they ride to a special place he wanted to show her. They packed a simple picnic and set out, riding higher into the foothills than they had ventured before. The trail wound through stands of aspen trees, whose leaves had begun to turn golden in the approaching autumn. After an hour's ride, they emerged onto a plateau overlooking a pristine alpine lake, its surface reflecting the surrounding mountains like a mirror. Wildflowers still bloomed along its shores, creating a carpet of blue and purple against the green grass. "Tucker, it's beautiful," Harriet breathed, dismounting to take in the view. "Found it my first year here," he said, tying their horses to a nearby tree. "Come up sometimes when I need to think. Haven't shared it with anyone before." The significance of his words wasn't lost on Harriet. This was a private sanctuary. He was inviting her into a piece of himself he was choosing to share. They spread their picnic on a sun-warmed rock overlooking the lake, sharing bread, cheese, and dried apple slices as they talked and watched eagles soar above the water. "What made you decide to become a teacher?" Tucker asked, stretching out his long legs and leaning back on his elbows. Harriet smiled, thinking back. "There was a teacher when I was young, Miss Holloway. She saw something in me that others missed. I was shy, bookish, always hiding behind my texts. She drew me out, helped me find my voice." She looked out over the tranquil lake. I wanted to do that for other children, help them discover themselves. Tucker nodded, understanding in his eyes. You'd be good at that. You have a way of listening that makes a person want to talk. Is that why you tell me things you don't tell others? Harriet asked, surprised by her own boldness. Tucker's gaze was steady on her face. Partly. Also because you understand, you don't judge. Why would I judge you? Tucker sat up, his expression serious. Some would, for walking away from civilization, for choosing solitude over society. Is that what you've chosen? Harriet asked quietly. Solitude. Forever. The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken implications. Tucker looked away, his eyes tracking an eagle as it swooped low over the lake. Didn't think I wanted anything else, he said finally. Until recently. Harriet's heart quickened. And now, Tucker turned back to her, something vulnerable in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Now I'm not so sure. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. Tucker reached out slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek with calloused fingers. You've changed things, Harriet Thorne, he said softly. Made me question what I thought I wanted. Harriet leaned into his touch, her eyes holding his. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Good, he said without hesitation. Definitely good. When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. Harriet answered by moving closer, her hand coming to rest on his chest where she could feel his heart beating as rapidly as her own. The kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more honest than words could have been. When they finally pulled apart, Harriet felt as though something fundamental had shifted between them, a threshold crossed from which there was no returning. I've wanted to do that for days, Tucker admitted, his hand still cradling her face. Harriet smiled, feeling a newfound boldness. What took you so long, Cowboy? Tucker laughed, the sound echoing across the lake. Wasn't sure a Boston lady would welcome attention from a rough frontier rancher. This Boston lady welcomes it very much, Harriet assured him, leaning in for another kiss. They spent the afternoon by the lake, talking and kissing and planning, the future suddenly seeming full of possibilities neither had considered before. The ride back to the cabin was filled with stolen glances and shared smiles, a new understanding between them that needed no words. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, Tucker took her hand in his. Stay, he said simply. Not just for a while. Stay here. With me. Harriet's heart soared at his words, even as practicality asserted itself. Tucker, we've known each other barely 3 weeks. I know, he acknowledged. And if you need more time, I understand. But I know what I feel, Harriet. I've never been more certain of anything. Harriet studied their intertwined fingers, marveling at how right it felt, her smaller, smoother hand in his larger, work-roughened one. What about my teaching? My plans for Helena. Helena's only 2 days' ride, Tucker said. There's a settlement growing about 10 miles from here, Willow Creek. They'll need a teacher soon. Or you could teach here, gather the rancher's children. He had clearly given this thought, which touched Harriet deeply. You would help me do that. I'd help you do anything that makes you happy, Tucker said with simple sincerity. Build a schoolhouse right here on the property if that's what you want. Harriet felt tears prick her eyes at his words. After the losses she had endured, the uncertainty of her journey west, to find this man, this place seemed almost too fortunate to believe. I need to think, she said softly. Not because I don't feel the same, but because this is important, too important to rush. Tucker nodded, bringing her hand to his lips. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. The following days were filled with a sweet tension as they continued their daily routines while navigating the new dimension of their relationship. Tucker was true to his word. not pressuring Harriet for an answer, but making his feelings clear in countless small ways, a hand at the small of her back as they walked, lingering kisses when they parted to do separate chores, meaningful glances across the dinner table. Harriet found herself falling more deeply in love with not just the man but the life he represented, one of purpose and independence, connected to the land and the changing seasons in a way she had never experienced in Boston. A week after Tucker's proposal, a letter arrived from her uncle. A teacher was needed in Helena for the new school term starting after harvest. If Harriet was interested, the position could be hers. She sat on the porch steps reading and rereading the letter as the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard. Tucker found her there, her expression troubled. "Bad news?" he asked, settling beside her. Wordlessly, Harriet handed him the letter. He scanned it quickly, his face carefully neutral as he returned it to her. "Good opportunity," he said, his voice even. "Helena's a growing city. School would be proper, well-funded." Harriet nodded, studying his profile. Better than a hypothetical school in Willow Creek or teaching scattered ranch children. Tucker turned to face her fully. "Is that what you want, the city, the proper school?" "I don't know," Harriet admitted. "A month ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Now." "Now," Tucker prompted when she fell silent. Harriet gestured around them at the cabin, the land, the life Tucker had built. "Now I can see a different path, one I never considered before." Tucker was quiet for a long moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I want you to stay, Harriet, more than I've wanted anything in a long time, but I won't hold you here if your heart's pulling you elsewhere. What if I try Helena and it's not what I hoped?" Harriet asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her mind. "What if I leave and regret it?" Tucker took her hands in his expression serious. "Then I'll leave the light on for you, always." Tears filled Harriet's eyes at the simple promise. "You would wait." "As long as it takes," Tucker said without hesitation. "This isn't an ultimatum, Harriet. It's a choice only you can make." That night, Harriet lay awake long after she should have been sleeping, weighing the options before her. The teaching position in Helena represented the future she had planned, the reason she had come west in the first place. It was safe, respectable, a natural continuation of her life in Boston. Staying with Tucker meant embracing uncertainty, building something new from the ground up. It meant hard work and challenges she couldn't even anticipate. But it also meant love, a deep, honest connection she hadn't expected to find, especially not in the aftermath of a stagecoach robbery. Morning found her still undecided, going through the motions of their daily routine with her mind elsewhere. Tucker seemed to sense her preoccupation and gave her space, busy with his own chores around the property. By mid-afternoon, Harriet's restlessness drove her to saddle her horse, the gentle mare Tucker had been teaching her to ride, and head for the lake they had visited together. She needed solitude to think, to hear her own heart clearly. The lake was as beautiful as she remembered, though the wildflowers had begun to fade with the advancing season. Harriet sat on the same rock where they had shared their first kiss, looking out over the water that reflected the cloud-dappled sky. What did she truly want? The certainty of a position in Helena, or the promise of a life with Tucker? Teaching had always been her calling, but did it matter where she practiced that calling? The children of settlers and ranchers needed education just as much as the children of Helena's merchants and officials. And then there was Tucker himself, a man of integrity and quiet strength who had opened his home and then his heart to her. A man who saw her courage and her convictions and admired them. A man who offered her not just love but partnership in building something meaningful. As the afternoon waned, Harriet found clarity settling over her like the golden light that bathed the mountains. She knew what she wanted, what she had perhaps known since that evening on the porch when Tucker had first asked her to stay. She rode back to the cabin as dusk was gathering, her decision made. Tucker was in the barn, brushing down his horse after what appeared to have been a long ride. "Been looking for you," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Got worried when I couldn't find you." "I went to the lake," Harriet explained, dismounting. "I needed to think." Tucker nodded, taking the reins of her horse. "And did you think?" "Yes." Harriet took a deep breath, suddenly nervous despite her certainty. "I've made my decision." Tucker's hands stilled on the bridle, his eyes seeking hers in the dimness of the barn. "Whatever you decide," I meant what I said. "The light will always be on." Harriet stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face, feeling the stubble beneath her fingertips. "What if I don't want to leave at all?" For a moment, Tucker seemed frozen, as if afraid to believe what he was hearing. "Harriet," he said, her name a question and a hope all at once. "I choose this," she said softly. "I choose you and this land and the life we could build here together." Tucker's smile broke like dawn across his face. He lifted her off her feet in an embrace that left her breathless, spinning her around in the confines of the barn while horses nickered curiously in their stalls. "Are you sure?" he asked when he set her down, his hands framing her face. "Truly sure." Teaching in Helena would be easier, more certain. Harriet smiled up at him, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. "Since when have I chosen the easy path? Besides, the children out here need a teacher too. We'll make it work." Tucker kissed her then, a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, the challenges they would face, the home they would build, the life they would share. Later, as they sat on the porch watching the first stars appear, Harriet leaned her head against Tucker's shoulder. "What if someday I change my mind?" she asked, not because she believed she would, but because the question had been haunting the edges of her certainty. "What if I need to leave, even for a little while?" Tucker's arm tightened around her shoulders, and he pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Then I'll leave the light on," he said simply. "Just in case." Harriet turned to look up at him, seeing in his eyes all the love and understanding she could ever want. "That's a promise I can live with," she said, sealing the words with a kiss. The days that followed were filled with plans and preparations. Harriet wrote to her uncle, explaining her decision and promising to visit Helena soon. Tucker rode to Willow Creek to inquire about the settlement's need for a teacher. Returning with encouraging news, several families were eager for education for their children and had been discussing pooling resources to hire someone. As autumn deepened around them, they were married by a traveling preacher who stopped at the ranch on his circuit of the scattered homesteads. It was a simple ceremony with only a few neighbors as witnesses, but to Harriet, it was perfect, as meaningful and true as the man she was pledging herself to. Their wedding night was a revelation, tender and passionate by turns, a physical expression of the love that had grown between them in such a short time. Afterward, lying in Tucker's arms in what was now their shared bedroom, Harriet felt a contentment she had never known before. "Happy?" Tucker asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. Harriet smiled, pressing a kiss to his chest where his heart beat steadily beneath her cheek. "Completely. You, more than I ever thought possible," Tucker admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Never expected to find you, Harriet Hawkins." The new name sent a thrill through her. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Tucker murmured, pulling her closer. "So do I." Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow by mid-November. Harriet had begun teaching in their cabin, with 5 children from neighboring homesteads trudging through the snow 3 days a week for lessons. It wasn't the formal classroom she had once envisioned, but there was a satisfaction in watching these frontier children, some of whom had never held a book, before discover the joy of learning. Tucker had begun work on a proper schoolhouse to be built come spring, a simple structure near enough to the cabin for convenience, but separate enough to give Harriet a dedicated teaching space. He worked alongside her, helping with lessons when his ranch duties allowed, revealing a patience with the children that touched Harriet deeply. On a bitter cold evening in January, as they sat before the fire after a long day, Harriet shared news that would change their lives once again. "Tucker," she said, taking his hand in hers, "I believe we'll need to make the schoolhouse a bit larger than planned." He looked at her questioningly. Expecting more students, Harriet smiled, guiding his hand to rest on her still flat stomach. "Eventually. One who will be particularly close to the teacher." Understanding dawned on Tucker's face, followed by an expression of such wonder and joy that Harriet felt tears spring to her eyes. "A baby," he whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it less real. "We're having a baby." Harriet nodded, her own happiness reflected in his amazed expression. "In summer, the doctor in Willow Creek thinks. July, perhaps." Tucker gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious material on earth. "I love you," he said against her hair. "Both of you." As spring thawed the snow and brought new life to the ranch, Tucker worked tirelessly on both the schoolhouse and expanding their cabin to accommodate their growing family. Harriet continued teaching, her condition becoming more visible as the months passed, much to the fascination of her young students. In July, as predicted, their daughter came into the world, a strong, healthy girl with her father's blue eyes and a tuft of her mother's dark hair. They named her Hope, for what she represented to both of them, the promise of the future, the continuation of the life they had built together. Standing on the porch one evening, Hope cradled in his arms while Harriet rested inside. Tucker looked out over his land with a sense of completeness he had never thought to experience. The war and its nightmares seemed further away now, the memories less haunting in the face of the new memories he was creating. Inside the cabin, a lamp burned in the window not because anyone was expected, but as a symbol of the home they had made, a beacon in the wilderness that said, "Here is love, here is family, here is belonging." When Harriet joined him, slipping her arm around his waist and leaning her head against his shoulder, Tucker knew with bone-deep certainty that he had found his place in the world, not in solitude as he had once believed, but in the heart of the family they had formed together. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Harriet asked, reaching up to smooth the furrow from his brow. Tucker smiled down at her, then at their sleeping daughter. "About how differently things might have turned out if I hadn't heard those shots that day. If you had continued to Helena without stopping. If I had left instead of staying," Harriet added softly. Tucker nodded, remembering that moment of uncertainty when he hadn't known which path she would choose. "I meant what I said then, you know, about leaving the light on." "I know you did," Harriet said, her eyes reflecting the stars that had begun to appear above them. "That's one of the reasons I stayed." Tucker raised an eyebrow. "One of the reasons?" Harriet laughed softly, mindful of their sleeping daughter. "Well, there was also the matter of being hopelessly in love with you." "Ah," Tucker said with mock seriousness. "That is a compelling reason." "I thought so," Harriet agreed, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. As the night deepened around their home, Tucker Hawkins held his family close, grateful beyond words for the twist of fate that had brought Harriet into his life. What had begun as a chance encounter on a dusty road had become everything: a love that sustained him, a family that completed him, a future that promised more joy than he had ever thought possible. And in the window of their cabin, the lamp burned steadily, a promise kept, and a reminder of the choice that had brought them to this moment together, under the vast Montana sky, home at last.